$480 in cash. Right now. And we forget this ever happened. That's the friendly price. I'd like a receipt for that. There's no receipt. That's not how tonight works, friend. Keep your hands flat on the hood. What am I being charged with? Nothing, if you're smart. Everything, if you're not. Your call. Sergeant Ray Doyle had run this exact conversation more times than he could count, and it always went the same way. A frightened driver. A dark corner of Kingsley. A little cash that never touched a single piece of paper. He looked at the man bent over the hood of the SUV, the out-of-town plates, the tired eyes, the son sitting quietly in the passenger seat, and Doyle saw exactly what he always saw. Someone with no power, no leverage, and no way to reach him. What Doyle did not see was the phone recording from the passenger seat. He did not see the second phone recording from inside the gas station window, held by a young woman who had frozen the instant she recognized what she was watching. He did not see that the man bending over the hood was memorizing his badge number, his unit code, and the exact second a body camera light went dark. And Doyle had no way of knowing that in 4 days, this same man would be standing at the front of his precinct, wearing the 4 stars of the chief of police. If you believe that doing the right thing still matters, even when no one important is watching, even when the person being wronged looks like they can't fight back, then this channel is for you. Subscribe, and stay with this one all the way to the end, because what happens to Ray Doyle is exactly what justice is supposed to look like. Not loud, not cruel, just complete. Elias Warren had spent 22 years learning how a city rots from the inside before it ever looks broken from the outside. He had walked precincts in 3 states that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. He had sat across from officers who genuinely believed accountability was a word for other people. He had rebuilt trust between departments and neighborhoods that had stopped speaking to each other entirely, one honest conversation at a time. He had spent years inside internal affairs, in the rooms where complaints went to quietly die, and he had learned the single most important thing a reformer can learn. The worst corruption is not the kind that leaves bruises. It's the kind that leaves nothing at all. No report, no record, no proof. Just a person driving home in the dark, poorer than they were an hour ago, certain that no one would ever believe them. He had never done any of it for recognition. He had done it because his father had taught him to, and because he was good at it. And for most of his life, that combination had been enough. Now, at 46, Elias was 3 days away from becoming the new chief of police of Kingsley, a mid-sized city in Merritt County that had spent the last decade quietly losing the faith of the people it was supposed to protect. The council had voted for him unanimously. The appointment was already signed. The formal introduction to the department was scheduled for Thursday morning, in full dress uniform, in front of every officer on every shift. But here's the part that mattered. His name had gone out in a single internal memo. 1 page, formal, easy to skim and file before lunch. No press conference, no photograph, no profile in the local paper. To almost every officer in Kingsley, the incoming chief was still just a name on a piece of paper, a resume. 2 decades in law enforcement, a specialty in internal accountability and integrity reform. A reputation, but no face. Elias preferred it that way, at least for a few more days. That was why, instead of arriving Thursday morning in a department vehicle with an escort, he drove himself into Kingsley on Sunday evening. His 12-year-old son, Theo, sat in the passenger seat with headphones around his neck. A lease for a small furnished rental was already signed. A bag of clothes sat in the trunk. He wanted to see the city before the city started performing for him. He wanted to walk the neighborhoods, eat at the diners, drive the patrol routes at night, and understand what Kingsley actually felt like from the sidewalk before he ever sat behind a desk, and everyone around him started telling him only what they thought he wanted to hear. It was not a trap he was setting. It was not a test. It was just a father and his son arriving 4 days early. Because Elias had always believed the worst thing a leader could do was walk into a room and immediately start talking. Theo watched the unfamiliar streets slide past the window and said very little, which was his way of paying very close attention to everything. He had his mother's habit of going quiet when he was thinking hard. Naomi used to do the exact same thing, and it still caught Elias off guard. 2 years after the illness took her, to see her stillness living on in their son's face. Theo had one habit Elias never interrupted. Every night, before bed, The boy took his mother's old wristwatch out of his pocket, checked it against the clock, and set it to the correct time. The watch had stopped running the week Naomi died. Theo kept setting it anyway. Elias had never once told him to stop. They found the rental, unpacked in under an hour, and by 7 in the evening, the refrigerator was empty, and Theo had declared the lack of cereal a genuine emergency. Elias told him they'd make a quick run. There was a gas station with a convenience store a few blocks over on Delmar Street. They drove over in the SUV. Elias parked at the curb, told Theo to wait, and went in alone for cereal and a bottle of water. He was back outside in under 10 minutes, a paper bag in his left hand, keys in his right. He never made it to the driver's door. "Hey, hold up right there." The voice came from behind him, flat and certain, the voice of a man who had already decided how the next 5 minutes were going to go. Sergeant Ray Doyle was already out of his cruiser. He walked the way certain men in uniform walk when they've decided the outcome, before the conversation starts. Shoulders back, unhurried, no question anywhere in his posture. Behind him, a younger officer named Daniel Pike climbed out of the passenger side and hung back near the rear bumper, hands loose, eyes on the ground. Doyle pointed at the SUV's rear plate. "Registration's out of state. That's a flag around here." He said it the way people say things they don't actually care about. The reason wasn't the plate. The plate was just the excuse. License and registration. Elias set the paper bag on the hood and produced both without a word. He handed them over and stood still while Doyle studied them with the particular expression of a man searching for a problem he could use rather than a problem he could solve. Doyle looked at the documents. He looked at Elias's face. He looked back at the plates. "You're a long way from home." "Just moved in tonight," Elias said. Doyle handed the documents back, but he didn't step away. He stood at a distance that was a full foot closer than any legitimate stop ever requires. "Here's what I'm going to do for you," he said, lowering his voice into a register calibrated to travel exactly as far as one man and no farther. 480, cash, right now. You hand it over. I don't write any of this up. You drive home with your kid. We both move on with our night." Elias looked at him without any expression at all. "I'd like a receipt for that." Now imagine that was you, standing on a dark sidewalk in a city you moved into an hour ago. Your child watching from the car. A man with a gun and a badge 1 foot away from you, telling you the price of going home. Most people, in that moment, do the math and pay. Doyle was counting on it. He had counted on it dozens of times. Ilareta did the same math everyone does. He just came out the other side of it differently. What happened next took under 4 seconds. Doyle stepped around behind him, put a hand on his shoulder, and turned him against the hood. Elias's chest came down against the metal, the paper bag crumpling to the side. Doyle patted him down both sides, slow enough to be deliberate, practiced enough to look routine, and his fingers found the envelope in the inside breast pocket. $520 in cash that Elias had withdrawn that afternoon because Theo's new school required the enrollment deposit in cash or check, no cards. Doyle pulled the envelope free, but his fingers brushed something else in that same pocket, a small, flat piece of brass, about the size of a coin. For the first and only time in the entire encounter, Elias moved, not to resist, just a small, instinctive turn of the shoulder, protecting that pocket. It wasn't the money he was protecting. It was Naomi's challenge coin, the one she'd carried every day of her career at the legal aid clinic, engraved on the back with 4 words she'd said to 100 frightened clients over the years. "You are worth defending." Elias had carried it in his breast pocket every day since the funeral. Doyle noticed the flinch, misread it completely, and grinned. He thought he'd found where the real money was. He fished the coin out, glanced at it, decided it was worthless, and flicked it back against Elias's chest. Then he stepped back into the light and counted the cash right there on the sidewalk under a broken street lamp, with the patience of a man who had done this 100 times and expected nothing on earth to interrupt him. 480, Doyle said. "The rest is yours. Consider it a welcome gift." "There's no law that lets you collect a cash fee on a traffic stop," Elias said. His voice was level. He did not raise it a single degree. "That's not a procedure. There's no authorization for it anywhere in your manual. Doyle stepped closer again. He dropped into the near whisper, the one built to carry no farther than the person it was aimed at. Let me explain how this works. I can let you go home tonight with your kid, and a warning. Or I can find something in that vehicle, and I promise you I'll find something that means you don't see that boy again until morning. Maybe longer. He let it sit. Your call. Elias said nothing. Behind Doyle, he watched Officer Pike lift one hand toward the body camera on his chest. The small red indicator light went dark. Doyle tucked the money into his breast pocket, handed back the empty envelope, and turned toward the cruiser. At the door, he called over his shoulder. Casual, quiet, the tone of a man closing a small business transaction. You don't want to be a problem in my town, friend. Trust me on that one. The cruiser pulled away. Elias stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights until they turned the corner. Then he bent down, picked up his wife's coin from where it had landed on the concrete, wiped it clean with his thumb, and put it back in his pocket. Inside the store, behind the window, a young woman named Camille Ortega slowly lowered her phone. Her hands were shaking. She had recorded the whole thing, and she was already telling herself all the reasons she should delete it. Elias got back in the SUV. Theo was staring at him. The boy's eyes went to the red mark on his father's wrist, where the hood's edge had caught the skin. Dad, did a cop just do that? Elias kept his eyes on the windshield for a moment. A man in a uniform did that, he said finally. That's not the same thing as the uniform being right. Theo looked at the mark a while longer. Then he held up his own phone. I recorded it. From the window. You couldn't see me, but I got most of it. The sound, too. Elias looked at his son for a long moment. And here is the thing that tells you everything about how Elias Warren was raised. He did not say, good job. He did not smile. He reached over, put his hand on the back of Theo's neck the way he had since the boy was small, and he said, very quietly, then we're going to do this the right way, the slow way, because the fast way is how men like that win. He drove home. He made sure Theo ate. He answered 2 questions about the new school. He said goodnight the way he had said it every night for 2 years firmly, without drama, in a way meant to signal that the world was still in reasonable order. Then he sat at the kitchen table and opened his phone, and he built a record. This is where you need to understand who Elias Warren was and where it came from. So let me take you back. Elias grew up in a 2-room apartment above a laundromat. His father, Samuel Warren, worked nights as a janitor at a county courthouse, the same kind of building his son would one day command respect inside of. When Elias was 14, a supervisor accused Samuel of stealing money from an office he cleaned. It wasn't true. Samuel had no proof it wasn't true, and no one important believed a night janitor over a man in a suit. He nearly lost the job that fed his family. What saved him was a small thing. Samuel had kept a logbook, every room he cleaned, every night, the time in and the time out, signed. He'd kept it for years, not because anyone required it, but because his own father had told him, when you have nothing else, you keep a record, because the truth is patient, and paper doesn't forget. The log proved Samuel had never been in that office on the night in question. The accusation collapsed. Elias watched his father sit at their kitchen table that night, hands steady, no anger in his voice, and say the sentence that would shape his son's entire life. You don't answer a man's contempt with your own contempt, son. You answer it with a record. Let the truth do the shouting. That was why, 30 years later, at another kitchen table in a city he'd lived in for 4 hours, Elias Warren didn't feel rage. He felt something colder and far more useful. He opened a blank document and started building the truth, one verified line at a time. He had Theo's video clean audio, the dollar amount, the threat about the child, the moment the camera went dark. He had Doyle's badge number, memorized. He had the unit number off the cruiser's rear panel. He had Pike's name off the tag on his chest. He had the location, the time down to the minute, and the exact window in which a body camera indicator went dark on purpose. What he did not have, and what he sat with for a long time, was certainty about what kind of thing he had just witnessed. One officer, one incident, one night. That could mean a lot of things, but Elias kept coming back to how Doyle had moved, the confidence of it, the practiced economy of the search, the specific, rounded dollar amount. The casual threat delivered at conversational volume, like a line he'd said so many times it had worn smooth. Those were not the movements of a man improvising. That was a man running a routine that had ended the same way, over and over, with someone too frightened to do anything but pay and drive home. And if that was true, then the question was never whether to report it. Elias had spent 20 years inside accountability systems. He knew exactly what happened to a complaint that came in with no video the department trusted, no witnesses the department believed, and a story that contradicted an officer's written report. He had read those files himself, in other cities, and seen the notes supervisors wrote in the margins when they'd quietly decided the problem wasn't worth the cost of solving. There was a deeper trap, too, and Elias saw it immediately. If he walked into that precinct tomorrow with his appointment letter and his son's video and announced himself, the investigation would begin with his name attached to it. Doyle's lawyer, when the day came, would make that the whole story. The new chief, settling a personal score before he was even sworn in. Even if it was a lie, that story could contaminate everything. It could protect Doyle precisely because of who Elias was about to become. He was not going to let that happen. So, he did the hardest thing a wronged man can do. He took himself out of it. He found the number for Renata Vance, the county's independent special prosecutor, an office that overlapped with, but answered to no one inside, the department he was about to lead. He typed a short message asking for a confidential call within 24 hours. He attached Theo's video, unedited and time-stamped, along with 3 pages of typed notes, and before he sent it, he read back what he'd written, and he noticed something. He had not written it as a chief. He had written it as a witness. Every fact he could verify was there, and every fact he couldn't was marked clearly as unverified. He had not named what it meant. He had let the record speak, exactly the way his father taught him. He sent it and put the phone face down on the table. Through the wall, he could hear the faint tick of nothing. Theo's stopped watch, sitting on the nightstand, set to the right time for a mother who was gone. Elias listened to the silence for a while. What had been done to him on Delmar Street was wrong. But he was almost certain now that it had not been done to him alone. And the way it had been done efficiently, without hesitation, in the practiced dark of a disabled camera, told him that whatever was happening in Kingsley had been happening for a long time before he ever arrived. He was 4 days from becoming chief of police. He intended to use every one of them. Renata Vance had worked in independent oversight long enough to know that the most dangerous misconduct was the kind that left nothing behind. She called Elias back within 2 hours, listened to the audio twice without interrupting, and sat in silence for a moment before she spoke. What she said was careful, the language of someone who had learned to separate what she believed from what she could prove. She would begin a quiet preliminary review before Thursday. She would route nothing through the precinct's internal chain. The video would be preserved under her office's custody from that moment forward. She did not tell him it would be easy. She'd been doing this too long to lie to anyone. Elias thanked her and did not call again. He gave her the space to work and spent the next 3 days doing exactly what he'd planned. Walking Kingsley, meeting the community council, taking Theo to orientation at his new school. He kept his mouth shut about Delmar Street. His name stayed a piece of paper most people hadn't read. The first thing Vance found when she pulled the records was the absence of records. There was no citation issued to Elias Warren that Sunday night, no stop logged under his plate, no notation of any search or property seizure anywhere. The shift report for Doyle and Pike described a routine community contact on Delmar Street, the kind of 30-second entry designed to be invisible among hundreds of identical ones filed every month. In the officer narrative, Doyle had written that a motorist was advised regarding registration and departed voluntarily. Pike's body camera showed a gap that lined up with the encounter exactly. The device log listed the cause as a battery fault. There was no maintenance request filed afterward. No supervisor had found it strange enough to ask a single question. According to the paperwork, a camera had simply failed at the precise minute a threat was made against a child, and then healed itself, and no one had noticed. Doyle's personnel file held 11 years of service, 3 commendations for community engagement, and no sustained complaints. 2 prior allegations had been reviewed and quietly closed at the precinct level, and neither had ever reached Vance's office. Both files were thin. Vance had seen this shape before. Not the specifics, the shape. The shape of a record kept not by a man doing his job well, but by a man who understood exactly what documentation was worth and how to turn it against the people it was meant to protect. Doyle hadn't avoided complaints because nothing happened. He'd avoided sustained complaints because he chose his targets with care and understood a simple, chilling truth. A missing record is far more durable than a favorable one. She flagged both closed files and kept pulling. She'd meant to look at 60 days. Something in the data kept dragging her forward to 90, then to a full 13 months. She cross-referenced patrol schedules for the shifts. Doyle and Pike shared a sector against dispatch logs for stops that generated no follow-up paperwork. The pattern wasn't hidden. It wasn't even subtle, once you knew to look. It had simply never been looked for. 9 separate incidents over 13 months. 9 stops on low-camera corridors. 9 people who were alone, who had out-of-area plates or identification, or who had recently contacted city services in ways that marked them as newcomers who wouldn't know local procedure. 9 body camera gaps of varying length, everyone blamed on equipment, not one of them triggering a maintenance report. 9 encounters that ended with no citation, no arrest, and a single line noting the officer made contact and the civilian departed. No money appeared in any of them. Of course it didn't. Cash leaves no trace, and Doyle was precise about what he allowed to exist on paper. But the people left traces. And when Vance located 4 of them, what she found was not hard to understand. A rideshare driver said Doyle had taken $190 from him and called it a fee for a vehicle inspection that never happened. A hospital night shift aide said she'd handed over $400 in cash after Doyle threatened to open a report that could suspend her certification. She hadn't done anything wrong. A college student said his rent money vanished from his wallet during a search he never consented to and couldn't refuse. And an elderly man said he'd been walked to an ATM 2 blocks from where he was stopped and told to withdraw cash while Pike waited on the corner. None of them had video. None of them had been believed. The rideshare driver's complaint had been reviewed and returned as inconsistent with the officer's account. The aide had been told there was insufficient corroborating evidence. The student's filing was logged as a misunderstanding regarding search procedure. And the old man had never filed anything at all, because he'd known, standing at that ATM, that no one would help him. And because he'd learned long ago that filing a complaint against a cop in a city where you have no connections is just a way of making yourself a target. They had all been right, every one of them, right up until now. There was a 5th name Vance almost missed, buried in a closed file from years earlier, a night janitor named Hector Ortega, who had reported losing a week's rent to an officer during a walking stop and had died 2 years ago without ever being believed. The complaint had been filed on his behalf, once, by a legal aid attorney who'd tried and failed to get it taken seriously. The attorney's name, in the margin of that old file, was Naomi Warren. Vance sat very still when she saw it. She did not yet know what it meant. She wrote it down. She sat with the full picture for an hour before she called Elias. The documented amount across the cases already exceeded $11,000. Doyle hadn't stumbled into these situations, she told him. He had constructed them using the geography of his routes, the timing of his shifts, and the specific vulnerabilities of the people he chose to build something that looked, from the outside, exactly like a police officer doing his job. Elias listened to all of it without a word. When she finished, he asked her one question. He asked whether the cases could stand without his name anywhere on them. Vance understood immediately why he was asking. She told him she believed they could, and that she'd need more time to be certain. He told her to take all the time she needed. Then he told her something she hadn't expected. He said the thing making him angriest was not what had been taken from him. It was that he was only being listened to now because of what he was about to become. Every person she'd found had said the exact things he'd said and been answered with silence, because they held no position that made silence uncomfortable for anyone. Vance did not respond to that directly. She wrote that down too. The department grapevine moved faster than any official channel it always does. By midweek, word had spread among the senior patrol staff that the incoming chief came out of internal accountability and had, in at least one prior post, reopened complaint files everyone thought were dead and buried. The specifics were vague. The anxiety was not. Doyle heard it on Tuesday. He didn't know the new chief's face, he hadn't gone to the council session, and the memo carried no photo. What he knew was the summary. 2 decades in law enforcement, a specialty in officer accountability and integrity reform. He'd seen that kind of chief before, in other departments, and he knew what that kind of chief went looking for first. He told Pike they needed to move quickly. His exact words, as Pike would later repeat them under oath, were that if the new man wants to go digging, there needs to be nothing left in the ground to find. Pike was not calm about any of this. He hadn't been calm for days. What had started years ago as a young officer's quiet calculation that staying silent was easier than speaking up had compounded into something he could no longer step out of cleanly. He knew what was in those altered reports. He knew what was in the small notebook Doyle kept in his locker, the one with the dates and the amounts and the abbreviations that were nowhere near as cryptic as Doyle believed. Pike had stood on a dozen sidewalks and told himself that not being the one to ask was not the same as being the one to take. For a long time, that distinction had let him sleep. It didn't work anymore. He did what Doyle asked. He opened 2 reports and softened the timelines. He formatted the entries the way Doyle told him to. He stood in the locker room while Doyle fed torn notebook pages into the shredder by the equipment cage, one thin strip at a time. What Doyle did not know was that Pike had photographed every page of that notebook the night before, the same night Elias's message landed in Vance's inbox, and the precinct's internal system began showing unusual record access from her office. Pike hadn't done it out of courage. He'd done it because he'd looked at the walls closing in and made a cold calculation of his own. A man who can prove he cooperated early stands in a fundamentally different place than a man who's found to have helped bury it all and said nothing until the end. He had the photographs. He held them, and he watched, and he waited for the exact right moment to speak. Doyle, meanwhile, was sure of one thing. He'd been careful for 11 years. Whatever review the new chief ran, it would find what had always been there, a body of very well-built nothing. He'd constructed that nothing on purpose, and he trusted it completely. That trust lasted until Thursday morning. Thursday came in gray and cold, the kind of morning that smells like rain that already fell, and rain that's still coming. The precinct's main floor had been arranged for the department introduction. Rows of chairs, a council member in the front, officers from every shift in dress uniform filling the seats. Doyle sat in the 3rd row, left side, in a pressed uniform he hadn't worn in months. He'd arrived early. He sat with the specific stillness of a man working hard to look at ease. He'd run the logic of his situation a dozen times in the last day, and landed, every time, on the same reassuring conclusion. He was protected by the simple, beautiful absence of a paper trail. The council members stepped to the front and began the introduction, the familiar words about service, community, and the obligations of public office. Words Doyle had heard before and long ago stopped actually hearing. Then the side door opened, and Elias Warren walked in. He was in full dress uniform, the 4 stars of the chief of police on his collar. His posture was straight and unhurried. His expression was composed in the specific way of a man who has already decided what he is going to do, and finds the doing of it unremarkable. Doyle saw him from the 3rd row. The recognition arrived the way real shock always arrives, not gradually, but all at once, every piece snapping into place before the mind has finished asking the question. The face, the build, the steadiness. The same man he had bent over the hood of an SUV on Delmar Street 4 nights ago. The same man he had searched and taken money from. The same man he had told, in a voice pitched to carry no farther than necessary, that he didn't want to be a problem in Doyle's town. Watch what happens to a man like Doyle in a moment like this. The blood left his face first. That was the part everyone near him would later remember. His hands, resting on his knees, went slowly flat, then curled, then went flat again, as if they'd forgotten what they were for. His breath came shorter. He did not move, because there was nowhere on earth to move to. 2 seats over, Pike had gone pale and was staring straight ahead at nothing. "Please welcome the new chief of police of Kingsley," the council member said. "Chief Elias Warren." Elias walked to the front and stood before the department seal. He did not look at any one face in the crowd. He took the oath, in a steady, unhurried voice. He shook the council member's hand and accepted the badge. Then he turned to address the room, and what he said was short, and it was not about Delmar Street, and it was not about Ray Doyle. A badge doesn't put you above the people who gave it to you, he said. It puts you in their debt. Power isn't handed to us so we can find out how much people will quietly tolerate. It's handed to us to find out whether we have the discipline not to abuse it when we think no one is watching. He paused. One beat. Someone is always watching. Usually it's the person you least expect to be able to do anything about it. He said nothing else. He stepped back, and the introduction concluded, and the room began to move toward the coffee at the sides. Doyle sat in his chair and did not move. He had spent 11 years understanding precisely one thing, that the people he chose had no way to reach him. He'd been right about that, all the way up until 4 nights ago, when he'd looked at an out-of-town plate and a tired man with an envelope of cash and made the last confident calculation of his life. The man he'd told to stop being a problem was standing at the front of the precinct wearing 4 stars. And he hadn't said Doyle's name. That was the part Doyle couldn't read. That was the part that meant the story wasn't over. That whatever was coming had been in motion since long before Elias walked through that door. Probably since the second Elias got back in the SUV on Delmar Street. And Ray Doyle had been the last man in the building to understand it. He understood it now. The lawyer's letter reached the city manager's office on Friday, less than a day after the introduction. 4 pages, written in the fast, aggressive language of an attorney, retained overnight and told to strike first. The core argument was simple and, worse, it wasn't entirely wrong. The new chief of police had a direct personal grievance against Sergeant Ray Doyle that predated his taking office. Therefore, any investigation conducted under his authority was compromised by a conflict of interest serious enough to raise a due process question. The letter named Delmar Street. It named the date. It named Elias Warren as the complaining party, and argued that a chief who'd been physically handled and financially extorted by his own subordinate could not possibly be a neutral authority over that subordinate's fate. The letter wasn't wrong about the conflict. That's exactly what made it dangerous. Elias read it once at his desk, set it down, and looked out at the parking lot for a long moment. He had anticipated this before he ever sent Vance the video. He'd spent enough time inside these systems to know that accountability rarely gets broken by the people committing the misconduct. It gets broken by the procedural cracks that misconduct can slip through, especially when the person closest to the evidence is also the person with the most to gain from the outcome. Doyle's lawyer was trying to make Elias the story. And if that worked, if the case became, in any courtroom or any headline, about a chief settling a personal score, instead of about what Doyle had actually done to 9 people, then Doyle walked. Not because he was innocent, because the system had been maneuvered into a corner where proving his guilt depended on a witness whose credibility could be attacked simply for who he was. So Elias did the thing that costs the most and shows the most. He removed himself completely. He called Vance before noon and told her he was recusing from all direct involvement in the criminal investigation. He kept only the administrative duties he couldn't ethically abandon, protecting witnesses, preserving department records, stopping ongoing harm. But the investigation itself, the findings of fact, the referral to charges, every decision about what the evidence meant, all of it went to Vance's office and to the independent prosecutor, the county appointed. His name would appear on no charging document. If he testified, he would testify as a civilian witness, nothing more. Vance was quiet for a moment. "That's the right call," she said. "It's also the harder one." "I know," Elias said. "Make it count." He hung up and went back to running a department. And here is what Doyle's lawyer failed to understand. The evidence against Ray Doyle did not need Elias Warren to hold its shape. Theo's phone video was the most direct piece. Clean, time-stamped, the dollar amount, the refusal to give a receipt, the specific threat about the child. Forensic review confirmed it hadn't been altered. Camille Ortega's second video, filmed from inside the store, captured the same encounter from a different angle. An independent witness who had no connection to Elias at all. The body camera data told its own story. The gap in Pike's footage matched to the minute. A window when the cruiser's own GPS showed it sitting motionless on Delmar Street, with no impact, drop, or malfunction that could explain a camera dying. Someone had shut it off by hand. The timing was not ambiguous. What the physical evidence couldn't do on its own, was fill in the years behind it. That was what Pike provided. Daniel Pike requested a meeting with Vance's office the following Monday. He arrived with his own attorney, a prepared statement, and the notebook photographs on his phone, which he transferred to an evidence drive while an investigator watched. He answered every question. He didn't minimize what he'd done. He explained the whole arrangement, as Doyle had first described it to him in his rookie year: the selection criteria, the routes, the camera protocol, the split. He said he'd told himself for a long time that the difference between starting something and merely allowing it was a meaningful one, and that he'd stopped believing that somewhere around his 11th month, but by then the calculation of staying quiet had become its own kind of cage, and he hadn't known how to step out of it until the moment he realized it was about to close on him for good. His cooperation completed the timeline in a way no video ever could. It filled in the conversations, the instructions before each stop, the accounting after. It established that none of this had been opportunistic. It had been organized. Maintained across years with the same deliberate care, Doyle brought to his paperwork the care of a man who understood that a system could be worked in both directions. And then there was Camille Ortega. Camille had almost deleted her video a dozen times. She'd been raised to keep her head down around police, and she had every reason to. Her father, Hector, had spent the last years of his life certain that no one would ever believe what a cop had done to him. She had watched the belief drain out of him. She knew exactly what it cost to come forward, and exactly how little it usually bought. But when Vance's investigator reached her gently, through the old closed file, Camille learned something that changed everything. The attorney who had once tried to fight for her father, the only person in the whole system who had ever taken his words seriously, had been a legal aid lawyer named Naomi Warren, the late wife of the man, now standing at the front of that precinct. The man Camille had watched get shaken down through a gas station window, and quietly recorded, and almost deleted. Camille came forward with everything, not out of fear anymore, because for the first time, she believed it might actually matter. The indictment came back on a Tuesday morning in November. Ray Doyle was arrested at his home before he ever reached the precinct for his shift. The charges were extortion under color of law, theft, falsification of official records, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering, the last one stemming from a phone call he'd made to a prior victim in the week before the introduction, telling that person to keep quiet. Pike was charged as an accessory and for the camera scheme. In exchange for full cooperation, he pleaded to the reduced counts and agreed to testify. The trial lasted 11 days. Doyle's defense argued voluntary payment at every turn. The individuals had offered money in exchange for leniency. No explicit threat was ever made. The officer had merely exercised discretion within unconventional but non-criminal bounds. It was a practiced argument, delivered with confidence, and for the first 3 days it did not obviously fail. It failed entirely on the 4th day. The prosecutor called Camille Ortega first. She told the court what she'd seen through the window, in a steady voice that grew steadier as she went. She told them who her father had been. She told them what it had done to him to be disbelieved, and what it meant to her to finally be standing somewhere her word counted. When the defense attorney rose to suggest she'd misunderstood what she filmed, she simply asked if they'd like to watch it again. Then the prosecutor played the audio from Theo's video. The courtroom went silent as Ray Doyle's own voice came through the speakers. "I can let you go home tonight with your kid and a warning. Or I can find something in that vehicle, and I promise you I'll find something that means you don't see that boy again until morning. Maybe longer. Your call." There is no way to characterize that as a voluntary Malik. The defense didn't try. There was nothing left to try. Watch a man like Ray Doyle in the moment his own voice convicts him. He had walked into that courtroom still trusting the nothing he'd spent 11 years building. Now his face went gray, a gray that started at his jaw and climbed. His hands, folded on the defense table, began to tremble, and he pressed them flat to stop it, and they wouldn't stop. His breathing shortened into something shallow and audible. He looked, for the first time in 11 years, exactly like the people he'd chosen cornered, exposed, and out of moves. Except every one of them had been innocent, and he was not. Elias Warren appeared at the trial exactly once, on the 3rd day, as a civilian witness. He described what happened on Delmar Street with the same flat accuracy he'd brought to the notes at his kitchen table the first night. He did not editorialize. When the defense tried to bait him into anger, into looking like a chief with a grudge. He refused to give it to them. He answered each question, and when he was excused, he left, and he went back to work. He never once needed to raise his voice. His father had told him the truth would do the shouting, and it did. Doyle was convicted on all 5 counts. He was sentenced to 8 years, with parole review at 5. He lost his position, his certification, and his pension. Pike received 16 months and a permanent bar from law enforcement. He served it. He did not come back to Kingsley. But a conviction is not the same thing as justice. Elias knew that better than anyone. A conviction punishes one man. Justice repairs what he broke. And so the last chapter of this story is the one that mattered most. What Elias asked for after the verdict was not a press conference, and not a statement, and not credit. He asked that all 9 prior cases be formally reopened and reviewed. He asked that every victim be contacted directly by Vance's office and told the outcome. He asked that any money that could be traced be returned or compensated. And he asked that the official record for each case be corrected, amended, to state plainly that the complainant had told the truth and had not been believed. That last part took the longest. The bureaucratic machinery for correcting a closed complaint was never built to move quickly, and the language in each file had to be negotiated carefully to be precise and permanent. But it was done. By January, all 9 files were updated. The rideshare driver, the hospital aide, the student, the elderly man, and the others whose names had spent years filed under unverified were now, in the official record of the city of Kingsley, documented as people who had told the truth. And the record said so. The 10th name on that list was Hector Ortega. His case was reopened too, years too late for him to see it. But Camille was there when Vance's office formally recorded that her father had been right all along. She kept the letter. She said it was the first time in her life she had ever seen a system admit it had failed her family and then actually move to fix it. The policy changes were announced at a January staff meeting. Body cameras could no longer be manually deactivated during any civilian contact without triggering an automatic alert to a supervisor. All fines and civil penalties were processed exclusively through the city's electronic system. Officers were prohibited from handling cash during field stops, in any amount, for any reason. Any complaint alleging financial misconduct was now filed simultaneously with the department and with Vance's independent office, with no option to bury it at the precinct level. And every month, a senior commander was required to ride along, unannounced, on an ordinary patrol shift, in a sector they did not supervise. Elias explained that last one only once, and he did not argue it. He said that every rule his department enforced eventually came down to a single conversation between one officer and one person on a dark sidewalk, and that the people who wrote the rules had an obligation to remember what that conversation felt like from both sides of it. Then he did the thing that closed the loop. He took the money recovered from Doyle's cases, the restitution that couldn't be matched to a specific living victim, the funds with no home to return to, and he used it to establish a small legal aid clinic in Kingsley, a place where people with no connections and no proof and no power could walk in and be taken seriously by someone whose whole job was to believe them first and check second. He named it the Naomi Warren Clinic, after the one attorney in this entire story who had tried to fight for Hector Ortega years before anyone else would listen. Camille Ortega was its first hire. On a Thursday evening, in late January, Elias came home to find a standard evidence return envelope on the kitchen table. Theo had signed for it after school. Inside was $520 in cash, a property receipt, and a single line, confirming the funds had been recovered and returned to their documented owner. Theo looked at the money, then at his father. "Does this mean you won?" Elias sat down across from him and looked at the bills for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "Not just from this." He opened his laptop and turned it so Theo could see the case closure summary, the list of every person whose money had been returned, whose record had been corrected, whose word had finally been counted. There were 10 names on it. Elias's was the last. "That's what winning looks like," he said. "When the person who comes after us doesn't have to go through what they went through to be believed." Theo looked at the list for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and took out his mother's watch, the one that had stopped the week she died, the one he set to the right time every single night, out of a hope he'd never once put into words. He turned it over in his hand. Then, very carefully, he wound it. It started ticking. He held it up so his father could see, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the small sound wasn't already saying. Elias folded the $520 and put it back in the envelope. He'd deposit it in Theo's school account in the morning. That had always been what it was for. Ray Doyle believed his biggest mistake was not recognizing the face of the man he shook down on Delmar Street. But that was never the real mistake, and it's worth being clear about what was. The real mistake was believing that what he did was acceptable, as long as the person on the receiving end had no power to stop him. He had built an entire career on a single idea that a wrong done to someone weak enough doesn't really count, because no one will ever make it count. 9 people before Elias Warren told the truth. Every one of them was ignored. Not because their stories weren't real, but because they were ordinary people. And ordinary people, in a system like the one Ray Doyle exploited, are far too easy to disbelieve. So here's the thing worth carrying out of this one. Treat people right not because you've figured out they can hurt you, not because you've checked and confirmed they're someone important. Treat them right because it's right. Full stop. Regardless of who they are. Regardless of whether anyone's watching. Regardless of whether they will ever, in 100 years, be in a position to hold you accountable. Because the quiet ones, the tired ones with the out-of-town plates and the crumpled envelope and the kid in the passenger seat, sometimes they're exactly who they look like. Someone just trying to get home. And sometimes they're the person who's about to change everything. Either way, they were always worth defending. That was the whole point. Naomi Warren had it engraved on a coin. Fa. That's the entire lesson. Sheesh. If you believe a story like this deserves to be told, subscribe to this channel. There are more of them here, stories about people who were underestimated, overlooked, talked down to, and dismissed. And who in the end made the truth impossible to ignore. Because doing the right thing when no one's watching isn't weakness. It's the only kind of strength that actually lasts. We'll see you in the next one.